Before a nation goes to war, its people must first believe the war is necessary. This sentence was never spoken officially by any world leader. Yet it became the invisible doctrine followed by every government entering a major conflict. Wars may be fought with tanks, bullets, and flags waving under the smoke-filled sky, but they begin much earlier, quietly, inside people's minds, long before soldiers put on their uniforms. Citizens were being prepared emotionally, psychologically, and culturally to accept war not as a tragedy, but as destiny. They were not dragged into conflict. They were led into it, step by step, headline by headline, broadcast by broadcast. In the calm years before World War II erupted, propaganda was not immediately obvious. It did not shout. It whispered. It did not speak of bloodshed, but of duty, honor, and unity. And it did not ask people to hate. It asked them to belong. In Germany, this process began the moment the nation was humiliated after the Treaty of Versailles. Newspapers, pamphlets, and later radio networks repeated one narrative. Germany did not lose the war because it was defeated militarily, but because it had been betrayed from within. It was not a claim supported by fact, but it ignited something more powerful than logic, emotion. The seed was planted, an idea that the nation must redeem itself. It is easy to imagine that most people eagerly supported war from the start. In reality, ordinary citizens rarely wanted bloodshed. Mothers did not want their sons on the front lines. Farmers did not want fields turned into mud by artillery fire. Workers in factories simply wanted wages and stability. But media, when controlled and directed, can transform reluctance into conviction. As radio spread into homes, governments realized something dangerous. They no longer needed to persuade only the elite or the political class. They could speak directly to the masses. A message broadcast through a radio did not come from a politician standing at a podium far away. It came from a small box in the living room, intimate, personal, trusted. News did not feel like a command. It felt like a conversation. Joseph Goebbels, the mastermind of Nazi propaganda, understood this deeply. He once said, "We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect." This was the philosophy that shaped German media. Every word was a calculation. Every musical cue in a radio segment, every headline placement, every photograph of soldiers standing tall was designed to trigger a response. Courage was glorified. Doubt was shamed. Listening to state radio became not just a habit, but a patriotic act. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States presented a different narrative. The government initially maintained a stance of neutrality, but Hollywood did not. Films subtly began to show foreign threats, glorify military life, and portray overseas events as moral battles rather than geopolitical conflicts. A generation that loved cinema went to theaters for entertainment, but left with a sense of looming duty. In Britain, newspapers became one of the most powerful tools of emotional engineering. Visuals of destroyed towns, selective reporting of enemy brutality, and patriotic editorials framed the war not merely as a political necessity, but as a moral imperative. The public was not just informed. They were guided toward a single conclusion: there is no alternative to war. Yet propaganda did not always look like propaganda. It often looked like celebration. Parades, songs, posters, school pledges, and even children's books began to feature narratives of heroism and national pride. Poison does not always come in a bitter cup. Sometimes it is sweet. And that is why it is swallowed more easily. In Japan, the media machine wrapped war in sacred symbolism. The emperor was presented not just as a ruler, but as a divine figure. Fighting for the empire became more than strategy. It became destiny. Children in schools were taught that dying for the nation was the highest honor. Newspapers printed poems about sacrifice. Radio broadcasts blended military reports with spiritual language. War was not spoken of as an event. It was spoken of as a calling dot in every nation. The process was the same. First create fear, then provide purpose. The public must believe two things: that a threat exists, and that only unity through conflict can answer it. Media crafted both parts with precision. A citizen with a newspaper in hand or a radio playing in the background did not feel like they were being manipulated. They felt informed. They felt aware. They felt, perhaps for the first time, part of something bigger than themselves. And that is how wars truly begin. Not with gunfire, but with agreement. By the time soldiers marched, public resistance had already been softened. By the time flags were raised, minds had already surrendered. The battlefield was secured before a single trench was dug. The most effective wars, a strategist once noted in a classified memo, are those in which the people demand it themselves. This is the untold part of history. Governments did not simply declare war. The people were made to believe in it, and belief, once ignited, burns hotter than gunpowder. Long before the first tank crossed a border, headlines were already shaping reality. Newspapers became weapons, not in the hands of soldiers, but in the hands of editors, printers, and media strategists who understood a painful truth about human psychology. People do not fear war itself. They fear the idea of being defenseless, humiliated, or left behind while others rise in glory. The media learned to exploit that. In Germany, after the First World War, newspapers began publishing stories that painted a vivid picture of national decay, using words like betrayal, dishonor, and foreign corruption. Even ordinary policy decisions were described in dramatic tones, as if every event signaled the downfall of the nation. Readers were not simply reading news. They were being told a story in which their country had been attacked psychologically, and the only redemption would come through strength. Joseph Goebbels, who later became the face of Nazi propaganda, knew the value of repetition. His strategy was simple but powerful. Plant an idea, repeat it until it becomes familiar. And once it becomes familiar, it will be accepted as truth. He once privately noted that a lie repeated enough times does not become truth through logic, but through exhaustion. People stop questioning because questioning takes effort. While acceptance provides emotional relief, the radio amplified this effect. A printed newspaper could be ignored or criticized, but a voice coming from a radio had presence. It filled the room. It seemed authoritative. When a voice speaks through static airwaves with confidence and emotion, doubt becomes inconvenient. Citizens gathered around radio sets each evening, not realizing they were being conditioned, day by day, word by word. In the United States, media influence took a different approach. Instead of directly calling for war, newspapers and radio broadcasts began highlighting stories of distant suffering, tragedy, and moral injustice. They painted pictures of civilians under threat, not to provoke fear of invasion, but to create a narrative of responsibility. Messages were framed to sound like moral awakenings. If we do not act, who will? Ordinary Americans who had no desire to involve themselves in foreign conflicts suddenly felt like their silence was equivalent to complicity. Hollywood entered the battlefield next. Not with soldiers, but with scripts. Films released before America's full entry into war subtly shifted public sentiment. Foreign enemies were portrayed as menacing shadows, while American characters discovered courage and purpose through military service. The transformation was complete when entertainment became indistinguishable from recruitment material. A young man sitting in a theater watching a drama about patriotic sacrifice would leave not just entertained, but inspired to enlist. In Britain, newspapers published stories that emphasized honor and duty. Headlines were crafted not only to inform, but to influence. When the war effort required resources, the media framed rationing as a noble contribution. When casualties piled up, newspapers romanticized sacrifice rather than horror. Readers were not given statistics, they were given myths. Every fallen soldier became part of a legend, and legends do not provoke rebellion. They provoke pride. Across the world in Japan, media techniques took on a spiritual tone. Rather than using fear of invasion, the message was wrapped in divine language. The emperor was presented as a living manifestation of destiny, and the media echoed this by blending war reports with ritualistic reverence. Newspapers and radio broadcasts did not speak of battles in simple terms. They spoke of sacred campaigns, of divine winds, of chosen warriors. The language lifted war above politics and placed it into the realm of fate. It is much easier to die for a divine purpose than for a political order. Media did not always lie outright. Sometimes it only had to omit. Reports of military defeats were delayed or minimized. Civilian suffering caused by Allied bombings or flawed strategies was hidden behind vague language like unexpected complications or necessary losses. By controlling the flow of information, media prevented the public from asking dangerous questions. A confused population is restless, but a misled population is obedient. The greatest trick used by propaganda was not hatred, but unity. Hatred alone is unstable. It burns fast and collapses. Unity, however, binds people together even when they suffer. Media created the illusion that supporting war was not only about defeating enemies but about being part of something historic. "This is our moment," newspapers wrote. "The world is watching us." These words did not threaten. They seduced. With each headline, each broadcast, each film reel, the distance between ordinary life and total war grew thinner. People who once spoke about peace now spoke about duty. People who once feared conflict now feared not participating in it. When war finally erupted, newspapers did not have to convince the public. They had already done the work years before, and so the media did not just report war. It prepared it. It carved a path in the minds of millions, guiding them toward a single idea. War was no longer a possibility. It was inevitability wrapped in righteousness. By the time nations officially declared war, the public reaction was not shock. It was acceptance. Some even cheered. The battlefield of the mind had already been conquered. War propaganda rarely presented itself as manipulation. It did not announce, "We are here to control your thoughts." Instead, it wrapped itself in noble words: duty, loyalty, patriotism. And under those banners, countless people marched willingly toward conflict, believing they were acting out of free will. But in truth, they were following a script carefully written for them. Governments understood something profound about human nature. Most people do not want to be seen as violent, but they desperately want to be seen as righteous. So media messaging shifted. Instead of saying we must kill, it said we must protect. Instead of we must conquer, it said we must liberate. The difference in language changed everything. Killing becomes justice. Conquest becomes destiny. And hesitation becomes cowardice. In Germany, public rallies were broadcast through radio and replayed in news cinemas. Audiences watched seas of flags waving under torchlight, entire stadiums chanting in unison. Even those who disagreed with the regime felt a strange pull. Witnessing such grand displays of national pride from afar created a sense of isolation in dissenters. They wondered silently, if everyone else believes, am I the one who is wrong? Propaganda did not have to persuade everyone. It only had to make resistance feel lonely. In the United States, patriotism took a friendlier form, but the mechanism was the same. Films, newsreels, and posters did not directly call for militarism. Instead, they glorified service. Young men were shown smiling in uniforms, surrounded by supportive crowds. Factory workers were labeled as soldiers of production, turning even civilian labor into a form of patriotic combat. Refusing to enlist was no longer seen as a personal decision. It became an act that separated you from the national community. The key strategy was emotional inversion. Instead of painting war as an act of aggression, media framed it as an act of protection. Families were shown sending off their sons with tears and pride. Posters portrayed soldiers not as fighters, but as guardians standing between innocence and chaos. A man holding a rifle on a battlefield was not killing an enemy, he was protecting a child, a family, a way of life. The narrative was designed not to provoke fear, but to grant purpose. Japan took patriotism to an almost mystical level. Radio broadcasts were delivered not just in the language of politics, but in ceremonial tones. Reporters spoke of soldiers as living embodiments of national spirit. Dying in battle was presented not as tragedy, but as transcendence, a moment where an individual became one with the soul of the nation. When a mother received news of her son's death, media often portrayed her as smiling with pride instead of mourning. Pain was rewritten into honor. Grief was reframed as glory. Propaganda also weaponized shame. In various countries, campaigns emerged urging citizens to do their part. In Britain, posters declared, "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory." On the surface, this sounded uplifting. But beneath the polished words hid a message. If you do not show courage or resilience, you are holding the country back. Non-compliance was not just disobedience to government. It became moral failure in the eyes of the public. The most powerful manipulation came not through orders, but through identity. Media cultivated a sense of belonging, creating an emotional binary. You are either with your nation or you stand with the enemy. Nuance disappeared. Complexity dissolved. Citizens were no longer encouraged to ask whether a war was justified, but only whether they were loyal. In America, children in schools recited pledges each morning, slowly weaving national identity into their daily routine. In Germany, youth organizations trained children physically and mentally to see themselves as future defenders of the nation. In Japan, textbooks were rewritten to frame war as the natural expression of the country's divine destiny. Step by step, war stopped being a political decision. It became a cultural expectation. Media carefully blurred the lines between patriotism and obedience. To love one's country is natural. To blindly follow every command from its leaders is not. Yet propaganda made the two appear identical. Questioning leadership became synonymous with questioning the nation itself. Slogans like "One people, one nation, one leader" turned political figures into living symbols of patriotism. Attacking them was seen as attacking the homeland. This emotional conditioning intensified as casualties rose. Rather than retreat from war due to loss, media reframed loss as fuel. "They died for us," the headlines implied. "Now we must honor them by continuing." The logic was absolute. Death proved necessity. Every fallen soldier became a justification for more soldiers to fall. War became self-sustaining, fed by its own sacrifice. The brilliance of this manipulation was that it rarely used force. There were no chains, no visible oppression. Instead, there was applause, praise, unity. People did not feel controlled. They felt proud. They did not feel coerced. They felt chosen. This is why patriotism, once altered by propaganda, becomes one of the most powerful tools in war. It gives individuals a sense of meaning so strong that they willingly walk into fire. They do not see themselves as followers of orders. They see themselves as authors of history. By the time governments formally declared war, the population was already emotionally enlisted. Media had crafted the battlefield in advance, not on land, but in identity. Ordinary people, who might have once resisted conflict, now saw resistance as betrayal. The world believed it was acting in unity. But in truth, unity had been engineered. And once patriotism is engineered, it can be weaponized. When the treaties were signed and the guns finally went silent, people around the world believed the war had ended. Headlines declared peace. Soldiers returned home. Newspapers spoke of rebuilding, hope, and a new era. But something else had changed, something not written in official documents. The tools of war had evolved. The battleground was no longer territory or trench lines. It was perception. The world did not step into peace. It stepped into a refined version of psychological warfare. The media, which had been perfected as a weapon during the war, did not disappear. It simply found a new purpose. Governments recognized the immense power of narrative. They had seen firsthand that an entire nation could be led into conflict through carefully crafted messaging. That level of influence could not be abandoned. And so, the mechanisms of wartime propaganda were repurposed for peacetime control. Radio, once used to announce military victories, now delivered political speeches that shaped public memory. Newspapers that once glorified soldiers now glorified alliances and warned of new ideological threats. In the United States, the message shifted toward the fear of communism, building a culture of constant vigilance. In the Soviet Union, media portrayed the West as morally decayed, preparing citizens psychologically for confrontation long before the Cold War officially began. The same patterns repeated: create fear, offer belonging, frame loyalty as moral duty. Only the enemy changed. Cinema did not step away from war. It rebranded it. Films no longer told stories about anonymous soldiers on distant fields. They told stories that built national narratives. Hollywood crafted heroes who represented freedom and righteousness, reinforcing the belief that one side of the world stood for virtue while the other stood for oppression. In the Soviet film industry, the reverse narrative took shape. Western nations were depicted as imperialist and corrupt, poisoning their own people with capitalist greed. Each side believed the other had fallen for propaganda. Neither realized they were living in it. Even education systems absorbed the frameworks of wartime messaging. School books were edited. Words like defeat were replaced with strategic withdrawal. Atrocities committed by one's own nation were softened, disguised as necessary measures, or omitted entirely. Meanwhile, enemy crimes were amplified with dramatic language to maintain moral superiority. Children did not learn history. They inherited narrative shields. The most significant shift came with the rise of television. Unlike newspapers or radio, television did more than inform, it simulated presence. People no longer read about events. They watch them unfold in moving images, with sound, music, and carefully selected angles. The screen did not just present reality. It framed it. A single image could generate national outrage. A single broadcast could change foreign policy. It became possible to shape public sentiment not through argument, but through emotion, delivered in high resolution. The line between reporting and storytelling faded further, until the news was no longer simply news. It became a program. And programs are written with intention. Modern propaganda did not demand belief. It demanded reaction. It did not need you to agree rationally. It only needed you to feel something strong enough to respond. Outrage became a product. Fear became a currency. Patriotism became a brand. In this new age, people believed they were more informed than ever. They had access to more information, more sources, more voices. But overwhelming noise does not create clarity. It creates fatigue. And tired minds, just like in the past, long for simple truths. The old technique remained. Repeat a narrative until questioning it becomes exhausting. Replace silence with distraction. Replace reflection with reaction. Replace thought with impulse. So did the war ever end? Or did it simply adjust its disguise? Perhaps war is no longer declared with guns, but with headlines. Perhaps soldiers no longer carry rifles, but microphones. Perhaps the battlefield is no longer the earth beneath our feet, but the screen in our hands. When a nation can be led into war by media, it proves one terrifying fact. The most effective weapon is not one that kills the body. It is one that commands the mind. History books will teach about treaties, diplomatic strategies, and political conferences. But they rarely teach about this, the invisible continuation of war through narrative control. The same voices that once asked citizens to fight now ask them to believe. And belief, once shaped, becomes obedience. This is where the story turns inward. Because the real question is not how media manipulated people in the past. The question is whether it is happening again, right now. If propaganda once hid behind patriotic songs, today it hides behind trending topics. If it once lived in radio broadcasts, today it lives in viral clips. The tools have changed. The intention has not. And if the past has taught us anything, it is this. War does not begin when the first shot is fired. It begins when people stop questioning the story. They are told, asterisk, if media could make a nation crave war, what else can it make us accept? In the next episode of Hidden History Files, we uncover the financial architects, those who did not fight the war, but owned it.